Hello and welcome to season 2, episode 11 of Dualistic Unity. I will be playing the part of Andrew today.
And I will continue playing the part of Ray. Today we are joined by Ariel, a TikTok creator. She also hosts the Do You Have Space podcast. I was lucky enough to catch the first episode there this weekend, which was fantastic. On TikTok, she's known as Ariel Here and Now, and her content on there is very much in the scope of mental health, finding your peace within, looking for the beauty, being able to change your perspective, and find alignment with your life. Her recommendations are very applicable and easy to take in, and her insights that she shares always make you feel that you can relate to her path. And so without any further ado, I'd like her to introduce herself, tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and how you came to share this path with everybody that you do.
Yeah, thank you so much for such a lovely introduction. These are always fun to sort of see the reflection back of everything that you're creating. I'm sure you both have experienced that as well. So thanks for reflecting all of that back. It's lovely to be here with other people that I share this space with and just care about exploring consciousness and awareness, and that path of inner healing journey is a big part of it for me as well. So yeah, grateful to be here with you. Grateful for the introduction. Yeah, you already gave some of it away, but my name is Ariel June. I am a meditation teacher and an inner work guide. So I just really love working with people and just really passionate about helping people on their own inner healing journeys. And that can be a really abstract, where do I even start sort of experience. I'm sure you both have had in earlier in your journeys that own experience, like, okay, I'm starting to become aware of everything. But where do I jump in? Like, how do I actually get started if I want to become more aware, if I want to heal from the things that are keeping me from really seeing life, the world, myself, everyone as they really are. And so I really love getting to be a part of people's journeys of discovering the different processes and modalities and other voices that are really helpful to sort of unburdening themselves on that path. So that's a little bit about me. I feel like I could dive in a little bit to how I got here and more of my story, but that might open up a whole wormhole. So yeah, where would y'all like to dive in next?
What I've noticed from your content is that it's very universal. And one of the things that resonated with me is that it's a lot like the content that we try to create, in that you're not ever really pointing people to a particular structure or a particular belief system. It's like you've distilled those insights down to something that you feel anybody can use. And I'm curious as to how you came to that point. Did you go through a particular spiritual journey or pathway yourself before you took it upon yourself to distill those insights down and make them your own? Or was that something that just started from the beginning?
Yeah, great question. Man, I love this. These are my favorite kinds of conversations to have. So thank you for teeing up such a lovely question, for hosting these conversations. Yeah, I definitely grew up in a very specific spiritual tradition, which I feel like I've heard you both speak to your own experiences as well around some of this. So I'm sure there'll be lots of overlap, lots to talk about. I grew up in a pretty conservative evangelical Christian community and family. Both of my parents are actively pastors in that tradition, and really, I both am very grateful for the upbringing, and it also gave me a lot that I had to unburden myself from as well. So that was really the start of my own spiritual journey. Grew up with a lot of really spiritual experiences through that lineage. That I still feel really grateful for and feel a sort of connection to. I didn't always, that took some healing and circling back to see that too. But yeah, over time, started to feel more disconnected from myself in that tradition, and was really taught an emphasis of valuing the voices of leadership and authority figures over my own inner knowing or other worldviews. And so really saw that the path within that community to acceptance, to belonging, was valuing other voices over my own. I gave that a really solid shot for a really long time, probably a little bit longer than was really good for me. You know, you start to hear that sort of like small thread of connection that you still have to something else, to something beyond a limited scope. And I'm really grateful that I held on to that small thread of connection to myself and to everything else. And man, over time, slowly started to shed pieces of that, and slowly started, consuming other worldviews and trying to see things from other people's perspectives. I'm really grateful. I went to this really beautiful, tiny, like arts high school, and they literally, like a part of their curriculum, taught you how to have empathy and how to see things from other worldviews. And I don't think that I would honestly be where I am today without that. Like someone saying, like, how do you see the world? Okay, that was taught to you. Let's look at the world from other views. And like being able to take off lenses and apply different lenses was something that I learned in high school. And it took me a while to like not fight that with like, but I have to stay in this worldview. And so really grateful for that education around empathy and respecting and choosing to see the world from other perspectives. And then, yeah, little by little started studying beyond that tradition of Christianity. And man, I could hit the highlights of what really did it for me, but there were some specific pieces along the way where I was like, man, I think honestly, I'll just tell you the one biggest like sort of shift, like in my process of deconstruction, was, man, the way that I grew up raised in evangelical Christianity, the message at the core was always that God was love, like, and that was it. And then there were all of these other rules and ways that we should treat certain people that didn't feel loving. And I had this moment, and I don't mean to say that about everyone. I think even my parents, who are still pastors, and I have some family that are still very religious, and I see them love people so well, but I just saw throughout this tradition so many pervasive examples of people not loving, or loving with condition, which is specifically not the kind of love that I was told God was about. And so started comparing those experiences, and eventually was like, oh my gosh, if God is love, but the rules that people are putting around that cause me to be not loving, then that cannot possibly be an accurate reflection of the God of love. And that just like shattered something in me in a really beautiful, like helpful way. So there's a lot of other, I'm sure in both of your own experiences as well, like there's so many little dots on the map that kind of help you see things in a new way, but that was a really big one for me. And what a relief I remember going out that day, and like the way no one could have told, like they couldn't have seen the difference in the way that I was treating them, but the way that I felt that had shifted the way that I interacted with other people was like, oh my gosh, it was like the veil had been lifted in a way, or scales had fallen off my eyes. If you get that joke, 10 extra points to you. Yeah. So anyway, long story short, through slowly peeling back the different layers of that belief system, eventually, I think this is a very common path, got really into yoga, got really fascinated by yogic philosophy, started to catch glimpses into these moments of awareness that were not tied to necessarily my physical experience, but were something beyond that. Yogic philosophy and the people that I studied that with led me into neuroscience and like psychedelic therapies. And that all led into me studying Tibetan Buddhism and a lot of other things. So it just opened, it's just like, you open one door and then there's like 10 more doors and you're like, oh, where do I go in here? So yeah, that's been kind of a process of like my spiritual upbringing, slowly like pulling brick by brick, one piece off of after the other off. And then sort of reconstructing by like pulling from these different lenses. And that's kind of where I'm at now. I mean, I'm so excited because there's just like, as long as I live, it'll just be more study and more doors and more things to read and listen and observe and shift. But that's kind of where I'm at now, is really having a deep appreciation for the inner healing work, and for, again, just like wanting myself to be as unburdened by all of those things as I can, and wanting that for other people. And so that's kind of where I'm at here now. I did not mean to make a pun related to my handle, but I did.
It's all there is, right? No, I resonate with that a lot.
Yeah.
And I love hearing stories about people, and a lot of, for so long in my life, that was viewed as in such a negative light, like leaving a belief system was like,
right.
I literally equated growing up, because I was raised Catholic, and it was like, if you were atheist, you were a bad person. It was like they were
Right.
very much boxed up, or anyone who wasn't Catholic, quite frankly. It was even
Yeah.
my friends who were like Protestant. Like, I went to a very conservative Catholic middle school, and when we
Mm.
would go for communion, it was like, the kids who weren't Catholic would have to go up like this, and like they couldn't receive it, and it was like, it wasn't
Oof.
outright, but it was kind of like, oh, they're not like us. But yeah,
Yeah.
for me, and I'm curious about your initial sort of leaving of the belief system, because for me it was just, and it sounds like similar to yours, I just started asking questions, and I have always been a curious person, much more now. It's kind of like exponentially grown since, especially
Yeah.
getting out of a belief system. But there were just so many things that weren't making sense. So, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, I was like, 50% Catholic, where it's like, yeah, I'm still nominally Catholic because I'm afraid of, like, I don't want to burn in hell and I want to go to heaven and all that stuff. But like, so much of it just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And I was just picking different things apart. And it seems like, those sorts of things, they don't promote this beingness of existence and questioning, and they don't really promote questioning. And people now will ask me like, oh, well, how do you know you're right? And it's like, I don't know that I'm right, but I just ask so many questions, and you're able to sort of pick apart all of these things. And I know that I'm not right in many ways, but it's not that I think I'm right and you think you're not right, or you're not sure. It's like, you're the one saying that you're right, and and I'm the one saying that maybe you don't. And also, I don't. And that's okay. Like, it's okay to
Right.
settle into the uncertainty of this moment and the uncertainty of the future. So, was that a big piece of it? Was you just started, it seems like things just weren't really making much sense. And especially with the, God is unconditional love, but, these people, we don't like them, and we don't like them. So it's like, how unconditional is that really?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I also love what you just called out there around the notion of right or wrong. And it's like when people are like, oh, well, how do you know you're right? And you're like, so I've stepped out of that framework, and now we're just floating. And if you can sit with the discomfort and the uncertainty long enough, you realize it's not that bad. And like, if I can look back at history and see like, damn, there were a lot of things we got really, really wrong, then couldn't I soften to the fact that like maybe we're getting things wrong now and just like let that be? And so it's kind of adjacent to the question you asked, but that notion of like letting go of this stark right or wrong was a big part of that. And yeah, and definitely a lot of curiosity, and curiosity in the environment that I grew up in, especially like the church community, was not rewarded. Like, you were rewarded for just believing and like blind faith and trust and all of those things. And so like, the more I was curious and like let that part of myself out, the more that was like, I felt like I didn't really belong, or like I was an annoyance or something, which is like, ironically not helpful. Like, if they wanted to keep me around, like there would have been some more engagement around that. I think not that I want them to learn how to keep people around if they want to leave, but that would be beneficial to them for sure. But yeah, definitely questioning a lot of different pieces was a big part of it. Questioning different beliefs, really looking at them a little bit closer, and yeah, I already said this, but most importantly, just letting go of that framework of right or wrong, and being willing to acknowledge if we've got it wrong before. And we see clearly in history so many times that we have messed it up so badly, especially when it comes to how we treat other people, which was my biggest qualm with what I was seeing. Then why would we just assume that we have it figured out now? And couldn't we create a little bit of space to acknowledge that we've been wrong before, so we'll probably be wrong again, and allow that to just be. So yeah, that was definitely a big factor in that deconstruction process.
I like how you put that. Can we just have some space? Can we hold some space just to have this conversation, so we're not so insecure that the idea of doing something wrong sends us screaming in the other direction, so we can't have this conversation? Let's just have a little moment, right? Let's just talk to one another without reacting immediately, and maybe we'll come up with an insight. And it's something my wife often talks about, because she's in counseling, and so holding space is something that she she often refers to, because she works with indigenous tribes here on the island. And so that's something that's part of their culture, is keeping space for one another, right? And that's it. It's just getting out of that reactionary mindset where it's like, oh, I feel invalidated. No, it's like, that's okay. You can feel invalidated. That's how you grow, right? You can feel like you maybe didn't do things properly, or you didn't do things to the best of your ability, because that's how you grow. But it's also important to recognize that you couldn't get to that insight without those mistakes.
Right.
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 So it's kind
Absolutely.
of a two-edged sword.
Yeah. And it's so interesting, at least within, Ray, remind me, do you have a background within Christianity? I've heard you speak about your views of Christianity, but is that your background as well?
I was born and raised Roman Catholic, extremely Roman Catholic.
Okay. Yeah. So I know deconstruction has probably been a big part of your process then too, for sure. Yeah. It's interesting though, when you come from a framework that is so, is just white knuckling certainty. And in some ways, I don't know if you both feel this way, I feel a lot of compassion toward that. Like, certainty provides so much comfort to the human experience that is full of uncertainty. And in some ways, I can even see, when I'm looking back at the tradition and like where it's come from, the beauty, and in some ways at the time, the freedom that it must have given, and the sense of safety, and the sense of community, and the sense of belonging. Like, I can see that in the span of history, and have, in a way, gratitude for what it provided to people. There's also a lot of things within the history that I don't have a lot of gratitude for, but I can see why people cling to it, right? But I also feel that there is a needed evolution of our emotional intelligence to recognize, like, okay, if we look at some of these behavior patterns within the church, in terms of how we treat what we think is wrong, how we treat people who we think are wrong, how we treat ourselves when we think we're wrong, or how we treat ourselves to make sure we don't do something wrong. Those behavior patterns, like on a psychological level, I'm sure that you've probably had conversations with your wife about this, if she's in this space, like, those responses, or as you said, those quick reactions, only internalize that behavior and cause it to persist more. So even on a psychological level, I'm like, this is not an effective strategy. It is an effective strategy for keeping people in a system, and that makes me really uncomfortable if we wanted to go there. But it's not actually a system that helps people get free, right? It's like a system that ensures, and I don't think that was the intent. I don't know, but I don't think that was the intent to begin with. It was like, here's something that we can try. And then now over years, it's like, oh, okay, turns out shaming someone for doing something wrong or for sinning only reinforces that behavior and really exiles that part of themselves instead of integrating that part of themselves. So we got to rethink this.
I find it to be very funny how the uncertainty, like, that is the reality of our existence, is uncertainty. And so when people feel like they are certain, it's always a false sense of certainty. So the same thing, although it seems in the short term to like soothe their fears, it also causes it because they're so easily shaken. And I've made, a decent amount. I've got, quite frankly, I've kind of toned them down a little bit, kept it to the podcast, but my videos questioning belief. A lot of times it's because my background's in Christianity and Catholicism. It's focused on that. It's sort of what I knew, but I would get a ton of backlash for it. And although I think it's very important to question things, I had to weigh, the pros and cons of all of that. And it was fascinating how much pushback there was. And it's like, that shows how this is not a solution. This false sense of certainty is not a solution to your fear, because all someone has to do is give a logical argument as to why it's not true. And all of a sudden you're going on a tirade about how it is true, because it is so closely held. And I've found that the things you question that are closer to someone's identity, their sense of self, who they think they are, how they define themselves, the more shaken they're going to get, the more hostile they're going to get in response. So it's like, that's so much of what we talk about is the illusion of identity and the freedom that comes with it. While at first it may be, a lot of discomfort in that, long term, there is a lot of benefit, because the reality is that everything is uncertain. So when you cling to a false sense of certainty, it only sets you up to go down this tirade when it's questioned. But we discussed that quite a bit too.
Yeah, I love that.
I was going to say, I enjoyed what you were saying about how the church actually served a purpose at one point in providing a certain degree of certainty. And I know as a parent that up until a certain point of development, you do give your children false certainty in order to protect them from their fear.
Right.
Right. And so that's great to a point, but then your child continues to develop. And if you get addicted to being who they turn to for that soothing, you don't help them develop anymore. Right. And so I made a video a little while back called Discover Transcendence. And I was talking about how the church came about at a time when there was a lot to fear, highway bandits and no real laws, and there was no real certainty whatsoever. But then they grasp to that certainty so much that somebody like Galileo comes around and goes, we're revolving around the sun. It's not revolving around us. And they lock him up for life. And it's just because they're threatened by how that diminishes the identity that went with their false certainty. So it's such an interesting process, a lot like parenting.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. I've been doing a little bit digging into that notion around parenting and the specifically we're talking about even around this idea of self-soothing and needing to teach children how to do that so that they don't continue to learn to put that what's going to soothe them outside of themselves or in certainty or in something else. It's like, how can I find that within myself is so crucial to our development. I think you're absolutely right. But I'm curious, I hope it's okay. I'm going to flip a question on you both. I'm curious for each of you in your own experience, or even just like now, what you think is, I don't know, helpful methods for detaching from certainty. I have my own answers to that question and what I know has really helped me shift, but I'm curious, for your own paths, like what helped you let go of that? What helped you see like, oh, I can let go of the edge of the pool and like stay afloat and not just need to grip onto that to survive, right? Like my survival isn't dependent on that after all. So I'm curious to hear about that from both of you.
I can start. I think recognizing the uncertainty at first is hugely important. Like actually realizing that it is the case, like there isn't anything that is certain beyond right now, and that's okay. Like becoming okay and sort of accepting the reality of uncertainty. And then I think a big part of it for me has just been repetition and taking action, no matter how I feel. Like my sort of definition of confidence, like a lot of people say that confidence is like a feeling, and I think of it more of an action. So in terms of when it relates to it's kind of related to uncertainty in a way, but it's like realizing that you're not always going to feel like doing something or feel super internally prepared for something, but it doesn't matter how you feel. It matters what you do despite how you feel. So confidence is about it isn't about how you feel. It's about the actions that you take despite how you feel. So for me, it's just been like that recognition that things are uncertain and sort of relaxing into that, because if you don't really accept that, I think it's very much more difficult to relax into that idea. And then it's just recognizing it and reminding yourself, I don't know. Like that's a phrase I use all the time. It's just like, I don't know, this thing I'm worried about happening, or this thing I'm hoping will happen. I don't know if this thing does happen, or this terrible thing that just happened right now in the moment, I'm labeling it as this terrible thing. I just said it was terrible. I don't know if it's going to be actually lead to something that's terrible realistically, because of uncertainty. All of these things that I'm so sure of are bad or good in the moment. The reality is that I don't know, because I don't know what they're going to lead to. And I don't know what that thing's going to lead to. And I don't know what that thing's going to lead to. So recognizing that has helped a ton. So that ties into good and bad, right and wrong. It's like, because we can't predict the future, because of the fact that we can't see and experience anything beyond right now, we have no idea what is good or bad. We can have senses of we take action in the moment relative to, how unified we feel typically. But the reality is that you don't know, and wasting time and energy judging it and allowing yourself to relax into that uncertainty helps a ton with any situation that comes up.
Yeah.
That was well said. Nicely said. In terms of a methodology, I always just I talk about potential a lot in terms of kind of like electricity. Until you point that electricity in a direction, it's just potential energy. It can do anything.
Mm.
And a lot of our narrative, a lot of our identity, a lot of our false certainty limits that potential in an effort to stay safe, which makes sense to a certain degree. I mean, if you're not used to being a nuclear reactor, you're going to want to tone that down, right? And so for me, my path, well, my life basically just from the start said certainty is not in the cards for you. I got abandoned as a very young kid, and then I got passed around quite a bit. And so for me, certainty was never something that I could find externally. There was never a home, there was never a loved one, there was never that support structure to reach for. There was never any certainty that I would be in the same place a month from now that I was then. And so for me, I only had one strategy for certainty, which was my identity, was the idea of myself. And so I clung to that. And over the years, as a teenager, I went through various iterations of that self, each one creating a totally different consequence for me. And then, okay, well, I got to modify that a bit. Let that one go. Let's try this. And then so I went through that over and over and over again, trying desperately to find a way to feel like I belonged in the world that was reminding me every day it didn't want me. And every day I was coming across the same hellish nightmare of constantly being unhappy and constantly seeing my friendships burn and fall away and constantly seeing my relationships turn to toxicity. And so the lesson was just over and over and over and over again. This is your control. This is what you're getting. This is what your identity is creating for you. And so after beating my head against that wall for years, almost killing me, I finally went, oh God, I'm still doing it. And that was it. It just dawned on me that I had been carrying this strategy with me moment to moment to moment, and it was causing all my pain. And so that was it. It was just like, okay, I got it. I'm good. Stop hitting me over the face with that. And that's when it got easier.
Wow, man. Thank you for sharing some of your story. I didn't know all of that about your experience. What a lesson to learn. Man, and to, like you said, like after a while, you're like, I get it. Okay, I'm ready to step outside of that way of being. It's not fun anymore. I don't want to get hit over the head again with that. Wow, yeah, that's so interesting.
It's very freeing, right? Like that's it. Is you spend so long trying to get free that finally, when you are free, you're like, this has been here the whole time. It's been available the whole time.
Yeah, that's so interesting too that you mentioned the piece about freedom. That goes back to something to Andrew that you were saying too, around like is this ultimate freedom that comes from knowing that there is no certainty, that there is no black and white, right and wrong. And what's the word that they use for it? Maybe either of you can remind me. In existential philosophy, what is it called? Something freedom, ultimate freedom. They talk about how terrifying it is, right? Like once you realize, like there's this moment, you get to the part where you're like, oh my gosh, I'm free and this is all available to me. But before that moment, I don't know if either of you experience this, there's a moment where you're like, oh my God, it's all up to me. And then there's like this, the weight of the freedom of that can be so terrifying when it's new, when it's unfamiliar. And like what you're saying too, Andrew, about just practicing really, like, I don't know. And I'm okay. That's okay. Like just that like creating that neural pathway of like uncertainty does not have to trigger a fear response. Uncertainty is something that I can sit with and that I can prove to myself over and over again that it is okay. One thing my partner says all the time is mood follows action, which also goes back to what you were saying, this notion of like, I'm not always going to feel like doing something, or as he often says, what is it? I'm going to most feel like working out at the end of my workout. Sometimes you just have to like trust the process and say like, I believe this, like I know that it will be okay. Well, I know that it'll be okay. I don't know that it will be okay. And that's okay too, but just trusting that, like putting that in motion is the only way forward.
It's an interesting point that you made about it being at that stage of it being terrifying. A couple of weeks back, we had another guest on here, and her point is often that this insight about lack of identity, about the lack of control, is terrifying. And I know from my own path that for a long time, I wrestled with the insight of isolation. I wrestled with the idea, or rather with the recognition that unity, it's just me, always will be. And that scared and depressed and frightened me. And it was because I was still identifying. I was still filtering that through my idea of myself, because without any of that, it's not terrifying, right? It's kind of like the difference between anxiety and excitement. It's just energy until you decide which way it's going to go.
Right.
Right. And so, yeah, I found that to be a big part of the start of the journey, was just recognizing that every time I felt that trepidation, every time I felt that resistance of that fear, it wasn't because of what I was letting go of. It was because of what I was still holding on to.
Mm.
Yeah.
Oh man. Yeah, that's so real.
I've found that since I sort of recognized that, this idea of Andrew is just a story sort of rooted in the past. Like, I am here and now. This kind of really recognized that last summer. And ever since then, there have been like so many ups and downs, as Ray can attest to. Like, it's been a turbulent ride for sure. But I found that when because I've sort of continued to recognize that and get caught up in identity, certainly, and forgetting here and there. But I think when I feel like, oh my gosh, it's all on me, it's just quickly recognizing like there is no me. And by getting terrified and jarred by this realization, like, oh, it's just me. It's like when you feel that with a sense of loneliness and fear, it's like, that's you continuing to try and cling to that identity that you have been able to cling to your whole life. So since then, I've sort of shed all of the things that I used to do to make me feel better. It was a lot of identity based practices and thoughts about myself and things I was grateful for about that had to do with Andrew, that I sort of recognized that idea of Andrew is the root of all of my fear and worry. So although there are two sides of it, and you can kind of get built up by your ego and it can help you feel good in a lot of ways. And people pat you on the back and tell you did a great job. But since more clearly recognizing that it's also the root of every single thing I've ever been afraid of or worried about or been nervous about, it's so much easier to let all of that other stuff go and sort of relax into that understanding that, oh, there is no me. So when someone asked me on a podcast once, like, when did you know you were different? And I was like, oh, it's kind of an uncomfortable question, because it's like, what I was just explaining to him the last 20 minutes is like, this idea of Andrew is a fiction. So to then cling to something like, oh, but I'm different, is like, it's kind of hypocritical in a way to then go back to that. So it's like you're only utilizing it for the good feeling stuff. But once you recognize that it's the same sword, that double-edged sword, or two sides of the same coin, you're more easily able to let that other stuff go, and you can allow it to be and sort of like move with things. So you're not just kind of an ass telling people that like I don't exist all the time. But yeah, the recognition has been helpful for sure, especially when I get caught up in that feeling like, oh, it's just me forever.
Yeah. I'm curious to hear what you would say your relationship is like to your own ego and to any like self-constructed notions of identity, because I am very much of the belief that exiling any parts of ourselves, real, imagined, created, whatever, is like not beneficial to our own unburdening in this human existence. So I'm curious to hear what your relationship is like now that you've discovered that, like how you engage with your ego or how you think about your ego. I have another question, but that's big enough. I'll pause there for now.
Yeah, I think it comes back to the recognition that like it's there. You can't escape your ego. You can't kill your ego, but it's not what you are. So it's recognizing that it's there, that it's your key to this experience. Ray and I have talked about this a little bit. Like, it's your ego is your ticket to experience. Without your ego, there would be no experience. So it's recognizing that it's incredibly important, and it's a huge part of you. You're not just going to overnight be like, oh, my ego's dead, I don't exist. And it's like, we actually recently, you might find it interesting, the conversation actually, I think it was a couple episodes ago on our last guest, but it's if you get too caught up, you can get too caught up in the idea that you don't exist. And That was
Right.
basically that entire conversation. And it comes
Ooh,
back to
interesting.
recognizing that that is just another belief. And that is just another sort of egoic belief in a way. So for
Yeah.
me, it's just recognizing that it's not the truth. Like I used to think that like Andrew was who I was, and that is it. Now I recognize that yes, it's still necessary for me to have this experience, absolutely, but there isn't this like end all be all super serious attachment to it. It's more like,
Mm,
whether you take everything in the world to be extremely serious and like super bleak and like dark and everything, or everything's not that serious and it's an experience, and the point of life is to live, sort of thing.
yeah. Yeah. I love the way that you described that. That was actually a question I came into, having heard some of your previous conversations around like not identifying with the self. I've had this question that's been percolating around, which I think you just answered for me around like, okay, so the self doesn't exist. I'm still a human having a human experience. So like, how do I enjoy that experience, and even be present to the shit I don't enjoy? Like, how do you navigate still being like, okay, so we don't exist, but I'm still here. Like I'm still having this experience. So I feel like, yeah, that was great. I'm very curious to go back and listen to that podcast, the episode that you were mentioning, but I think that's so important. And it's, in a way, we're always with ourselves and with that constructed self. And so it's a great, like consistent, like nonstop practice of holding onto something lightly, which is the practice of letting go of certainty, of just saying like, okay, this might be something that I believe to be true right now, but like even that I have to hold with like open hands, even my sense of self, even my sense of expression, this what I believe about the world, like all of that will be shifting and changing. And so that notion that you're talking about engaging with and relating to the ego very lightly, like I have this phrase I say to myself, why, of course, like, of course you think that, or like, of course that upset you, or of course, like whatever, kind of acknowledging, but with some lightness and with some general like levity, like, okay, yep, of course. And so I love hearing some of that reflected in what you were just saying too. I think that really resonates with me.
We were having a conversation the other day, and I think we put it something along the lines of you're always what you are and never what you think you are. So you always are. And I think that's the point,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
when I was a kid, you guys probably remember doing this too, playing make believe, pretending with your friends, coming up with scenarios. I remember when I was a kid, we used to all go into this patch of bush just outside of town, and we'd be like pirates setting up this pirate like hideout and booby traps and all that. And every once in a while, we'd be, werewolves and other stupid stuff. But the point is that whatever I was embodying myself to be changed the nature of the game for me. It changed the environment I was participating in. It changed my actions. It changed everything I
Right.
perceived because I identified as what I was pretending to be. And nothing's changed. Nothing has changed except that maybe my idea of myself has become way more boring over time, right? I'm no longer running around pretending to be a werewolf, but I'm still pretending to be something,
Right.
right? And I think
Right.
that is now my relationship with my ego, is that it's
Mm,
a lens that changes the experience I'm having. It's a lens
mm,
that can blind me if I get too caught up in it, or it can just color my experience in a pleasant or unpleasant way, depending on how seriously I take it.
yeah. Oh yeah, that's, yeah, beautifully articulated. I love that. Oh, we do have so much power to change that lens, and to, yeah, to allow our view of the world and of ourselves to be shifted. And I feel, I don't know if you two have run into this, but I feel that's as a conversation not everyone is ready to have. Like, I don't know if you've received, I know Andrew, you're mentioning some pushback on some different videos you've shared. I don't know, it's really tricky in the world to talk about that, right? Because I'm sure that you both would agree, like acknowledging that we have the power to change how we view our situations and view the world, I think can feel to a lot of people very like bypassing, or like not acknowledging the suffering that takes place in the world. And that I have found to be somewhat tricky to navigate, right? Because it's not to negate anyone's experience. There is undeniable suffering in the world. There is undeniable pain that is unavoidable. if we could all get together and let go of some things, there'd probably be a lot less. But I guess that's why we're all here to some extent.
It's a good
having
point.
This conversation.
It's something I've run across for sure. And I've been at this for 20 years. I was trying to have this conversation with people after 9/11, which didn't go well.
I can imagine. Wow.
You know,
yeah.
It's interesting if you were to think of it as, say you have a pit with a bunch of water in it and somebody is stuck in the pit. Well, help me out. So somebody else tries to help them out. They can't. So somebody's got to get in the pit to get their arm. And eventually you get a bunch of people in the pit, but somebody's eventually got to stand outside the pit to help the rest of them get out. Like you can form a human chain. Sure, going into the pit can help that person, but not everybody's going to jump in. Not everybody should jump in. Otherwise, nobody's getting out. And it's kind of the same thing about our misery and our suffering. Like it can be helpful to join somebody in their suffering. It can be helpful to be there with them while they are suffering and to experience suffering as a point of being able to relate. But if you're in suffering all the time, you're not going to do much good to help them get out of it. You might help them deal with it while they're in it, but you are not in a position to help them get out of it. Somebody has to have a foot in both worlds. It's just the way it goes. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a really solid visual to paint the picture of what that's like in the role that we have an opportunity to play in that. It's hard. I find myself torn a lot of the time, just feeling a lot of empathy for people that are, man, there's just, you both know, there's just so much suffering in the world and there's so much heartache and healing that needs to happen. And it's interesting sometimes when I think about this conversation that we're having around, the like self-created identity and obsession with that and attachment to that and attachment to certainty. It's like we can look at that at an individual level and it's complex and and complicated, but you can kind of like slowly untie the knot when it's like yourself. Like you can really go in and be like, okay, I see where I learned this. I see where I learned this, and slowly peel back these layers and shed new light, new perspective, new awareness on those. But approaching that on a collective scale, like I can't think about it too. Like I'm so curious about that, like what it would look like to have sort of collective healing and collective raising of emotional intelligence and collective freedom from a lot of beliefs that are really keeping us in cycles of suffering. And I don't just mean beliefs like, oh, if I believe I'm suffering, then like you're just causing your own suffering. We all play a role in our experiences for sure, but also like in the people who are actively causing other people's suffering. There's so much there. It admittedly overwhelms me, but also is like, I don't know, a conversation I'm starting to have with people. Like, what would that really look like? And I'm curious to hear y'all's perspective on that, because I'm sure y'all have gone there too.
Often and frequently, especially
I believe it.
For me, because again, 20 years of just kind of watching this, and it's really interesting because when I had back in 2005, I had a YouTube channel. It's called The Journal of a Forgetful God, and I was just basically going through all of this stuff, and I was getting a lot of blowback, and it was admittedly because I was being pushy. I had an idea that the world needed to be saved. I had an idea of what that entailed and what we needed to do, and so it's like I had all these ideals. And I wasn't aligning with reality at all. And so over time, as I've let go of myself and I've realized everything's moving at the rate it's supposed to, I'm in the part I'm in, I'm causing ripples and ripples are hitting me all the time. There is no separation whatsoever. Then you start to realize like, oh, okay. So just like an individual goes through thousands of thoughts one way or another before one triggers an actual movement towards one. It's the same is true with us. Like just because there might be thousands of people in one area, one of those people having an insight causes a ripple that may not be immediately noticeable because it may cause little ripples. And then somebody else has another big ripple and it causes another cascade of little ripples. But we are changing collectively, just like we do individually on a larger scale. So there's a lot of patience involved.
Yeah, I really resonate with that. And every time I remember that, I feel like, oh, relief. Like I think that part of something I still have to occasionally remember to shed is my upbringing, which told me I was responsible for saving people and making sure they went to the right place when they died. And realizing sometimes that I'm like, oh, but how do we help? And I'm like, you just have to sit back, trust the process, keep like you said, like there are these ripples happening all the time. And in a lot of ways, like I feel really surprised by all of these voices that I've come across in the last year or two through TikTok and things, right? Where it's like, oh, people are talking about this. And granted, my algorithm is like totally dialed to this channel for sure. But this is not stuff I grew up hearing from anyone about. And to now have that on such a massive scale where there are all of these little ripples that are happening in places and for people that maybe wouldn't have had exposure otherwise is like, does make me feel so hopeful and that it's trending in that direction.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, the recognition, because a few months ago too, I was talking to Ray about this and just saying how like I was caught up in this idea of suffering and like, how can I be happy knowing that there's so much suffering going on?
Yeah.
I think a couple of things that helped me in particular were the recognition that, we are the world, like we are it. So as we change individually, that's a drop in the hat of the world that is changing. So like all you ever have to do, all you ever really can do is change yourself. Like people tend to overestimate how much they can change things outside of themselves and underestimate how much they can change within themselves. So when you recognize that you are the world or universe existence is a tapestry and you are a thread woven into that tapestry, as that thread changes or it starts to shake, that is literally a ripple across the entire tapestry. And I think another thing that I realized at one point was, and I think we talked about this on an episode once, but it was, if you think that you have to change other people, you still think there are other people. So if you recognize that you are the world and your identity doesn't actually exist, and I know this is like getting a little bit deeper into things, but like if you don't see that, or if you still see that or think there are other people that have to be changed, you still see duality and you are taking that duality as truth. And while it is the crux of this experience is seemingly dualistic, there's a sort of freedom in the recognition. And it's not to say freedom in the way that all of a sudden, like all of your responsibilities are relinquished and you don't have to do anything, blah, blah, blah. But, if you see other people, you still haven't fully recognized that unity. And through that, you more understandably recognize that all you ever have to do to change the world is change yourself as you change the world does too. And I have found in my experience, especially talking about this stuff, that people don't really like being told what to recognize or what to do. If anything, it will push them further away if they're being told that they need to change for the betterment of society. So oftentimes, while it has good intentions, the reality of it is it's just making things more divided than they already are, no matter how good your intentions are.
Yeah, that's a really powerful perspective to keep in mind. I appreciate you articulating that. It's something that I believe. I'm like, yeah, totally. But it's just refreshing to hear and to be like, okay, yeah, that's right. I'm curious. I'll just be honest. I think that the exploration of like letting go of that duality of seeing a difference between myself and others isn't something I've explored a whole lot. I definitely get the essence of what y'all are talking about. And I've heard you talk about this notion on other episodes. But I'm curious, like, I would love to get a little glimpse into what that experience is like, right? I'm assuming at some point in either or both of your processes, you've had a moment, as we all do, where there's just like this moment of clarity of like, oh, I see that now. I see that unity with everyone. I see that lack of like otherness or separation or duality. I'm just curious if either of you have an example or experience of that, like at the ready. I would love to hear.
I can give you one from the last 24 hours of my life.
Oh, perfect.
So I have various physical ailments because I'm in my 40s. And of course I was stupid when I was young. And so I did all kinds of stuff that got me injured. And one of those things was just working labor jobs where I didn't necessarily take care of myself or how I was balanced. And so I ended up with all these knots in my neck, and they've been there for years. And so just became aware of those and started kind of working those out. And as I was working those out, memories start popping up. Oh. Memories from where these injuries and where these knots came from, right? And so working through them, and my wife was asking, well, how do you process those? And I'm like, well, I remove myself. And she said, what do you mean? And I was like, well, so I ran across one, and I immediately remembered back to an abusive point in my life where, you know, I was being abused, and where before I would have had that memory and I would have went like, oh, how could that happen to me? What kind of a terrible life? I would have just internalized it. It would have just been about me. I removed the character entirely. I'm like, oh, that happened. Then all of a sudden I have an insight about how the person who abused me wasn't the person I made an assumption about. It's not the idea of that person. They were abused by their parents. They had a life I'm not aware of. They had influences that I don't know. And immediately upon removing myself, I can see that my idea of them wasn't the truth either. And there goes that duality. That division is gone. Suddenly it's not I was abused, but abuse happened. And abuse was maintained habitually from that other person and whoever came before them. And so all of a sudden, the duality of that starts to fall apart. And I start to recognize that it was a part of me, just like, you know, something happening within my body, a muscle cramp or something like that. That's a part of me, but it's not something I like. If I was to vilify the muscle that's cramping, I wouldn't have the sensitivity to relax it.
Yeah, I love that example. Thank you so much for sharing that. I feel sometimes when we talk about these big concepts that are contrary to normal societal conversation around identity, it gets very like abstract. And hearing those examples, I think, are so helpful, right? Because you say that, and I'm like, oh, I had an experience like that yesterday, you know, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh, okay, that's kind of what it feels like to be tapped into that sense of, I mean, even what was said around the tapestry, this notion of being a thread in all, that you sort of see all of those other threads, maybe they're connected to all these other threads, and seeing more of that bigger picture. So thank you for sharing that example. It's lovely.
It's a fun conversation. It really is. And it's something that we go through all the time, because once you get rid of the characters, once you start getting rid of the idea that we are our ideas at all, well, then what you end up with is one free-flowing entity that's interacting with itself. It's ripples upon ripples upon ripples, but we say ripples with the same perception that we're separate. There really is no ripple because there's no division, right? and so it's a matter of sensitivity. And that's why often we'll talk about this conceptually. We'll point at it in the direction of the insight that we're having, but we can't actually communicate it because it's so vast, because it's so big, to see how reality is seamlessly interwoven, right? That we can't actually get there with language, but we can point the way, which is half the fun.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I think it's funny that Ray brought up one from yesterday, because I was actually going to bring up one from yesterday and say how like my sort of like initial inkling of this happened. And it's a very, you know, profound experience that I had last summer, basically, which kind of like woke me up. But you know, the thing is, it's not like it's kind of like the idea of the illusion of an ego death. It's like, as soon as you say I had an ego death, you're identifying as I. So you're using the ego to explain that it died. And it's like, there is no ego death, you know, that is you know, the ticket to your experience. So these things, the recognition is happening every single moment. It's not like a recognition and then it's just like, oh, and then everything's changed and like that's it. It's like you're going in and out, up and down all the time. But yesterday,
I totally feel that.
It's like yesterday, and Ray said this a few times, the idea just like, if someone asks him like, how do you know that we're all the same thing? And he'll say, well, everyone identifies as I, or everyone identifies as me, right? It's pretty obvious, no? Like I've always kind of gotten that. I'm like, yeah, but it's different eyes. And then yesterday, actually, I was just starting a walk around New York, was just going to wander for a while, and it hit me so much more clearly. And all of a sudden, like everyone, and it was pretty crowded, like midday on a decent day, Sunday in New York, it was pretty crowded, and no one had a name, no one had an identity. It was just like everyone I'm walking past identifies as I, or identifies as me. And I was like, oh my God, like we are all just awareness of each other within and without each other here and now. So I was just basking in that. It felt like I was full on tripping for like, I walked around for like 3 hours, like through some indoor little mall areas and like outside for a while. And I was just like, no, didn't listen to anything, was just absolutely in awe of everything for so long. And like I made a video about it. And then just like after that, just kind of walked around basking in that recognition that like there are no others, and everyone thinks that, like they say, I am Andrew, or, you know, I am Ariel, or I am Ray. And we all think we're that name, but we're all saying we're all identifying as the same thing. And it's like, I is everything and everyone and everywhere. So it makes sense. It's actually not a incorrect statement, but it's just I thinking that you are not I, that you are the name. And that's where the distortion sort of comes in. And that's what leads to this existence that has become very identified and very dualistic. And because there is so much need for this more for me and this identity, it's like a balancing act. Like as soon as something goes higher and hoarding for me because I am separate, there's going to be an equal and opposite effect on the other end. So that's where I've seen how suffering sort of ties into it. It's like our relationship with our identity and thinking, not recognizing that we are it. We are all threads on the same tapestry. We think we are separate threads wandering around, but there is no space and there is no time. So it's all the same happening here and now. We just think that it isn't. And we think that there's this separate identity, which leads to, because there's, you know, people hoarding so much for themselves because they think that's it and they've taken their identity to be the truth, there's not going to be enough left for everyone else to even have basic survival. So yeah, but that was a recognition I had within the last 24 hours as well. So but yeah, it's fun. And I texted Ray yesterday, like, I fucking love this stuff, man. Like this is it's the best, just, and being able to talk about it. So yeah, I'm appreciative that you're here with us now, enjoying the conversation.
You mentioned a point there, Andrew, and I was actually curious to get Ariel's idea on this as well, because it's interesting. Because if you look at all the cells within our body, they're all having an individual experience. They're all doing their own thing with their own reality, but they're all me, right? Like even if they identify individually, they all make up one me. And the same is true for the world, right? Even though we identify individually, it's all one me, it's all one world, it's all one I, right? But when cells start working against the body, when they start acting out of alignment with the rest of the body, we call that cancer. Right. And so it kind of begs the question of how much of our distorted mentality is not only adding to our stress and disharmony, which adds to our lack of health in general, but are we not also, in the same way we were talking about earlier, ripples affecting ripples, adding to the overall unhealthy atmosphere that we're a part of? Are we adding to the problems of the world simply by not addressing our own individual problems? Are we being cancer until we heal ourselves?
Oh, wow. That's beautiful. Really, again, comes back to this personal responsibility piece of just like owning what's going on here. I love all of this because I think that there's so much nuance to this conversation, right? There's so much. And when I mentioned people like receiving some sort of pushback to this notion that we have this responsibility for our experiences, for the way that we engage and relate to our experiences and to this notion of ourselves, it can be really, really tricky to identify that, because I think that there's so much fear in the world of not getting what I need and feeling like I have to look out for myself, and being in this survival mode that feels misunderstood and like I have to look out for me. And I think I have so much compassion for that lens. Like it makes sense that why anyone might believe that way. And I think that a lot of the pushback that I've heard, not just to my own content, but that I've seen in pushback to others who are having these conversations, is this notion that it's like lacking empathy, or that it's lacking understanding of other people's experience, or that it's, and to some degree, I would say that there is some privilege to it. This, having the space to sit with these questions and to look at the world differently, at least in my experience, does come from a lot of privilege, from having the time and the space and the energy and like whatever else to not just focus on all of that toward my survival. So I do recognize that there is some privilege wrapped up in that, but I love the way, Ray, that you just articulated it. The way that you just articulated it was very empathetic and very like compassionate toward the world. The sense of like, okay, I have a sort of loving responsibility, if we want to call it that, and I personally would, a sort of loving responsibility, if I care about all of this, to do my part to shift the way that is in the world. And without understanding the nuance that is within that, I think it can be kind of offensive to people who feel misunderstood in their suffering. But I just love the way that you articulated that there, because I think it really shined the spotlight on the empathetic lens, really the empathetic approach that takes, of lovingly acknowledging my responsibility to this oneness. And if I want there to be less of this suffering in the world, then there's really only one thing for me to do, and that's say like I right here can shift the way that I'm contributing to this energetic exchange that's taking place, and just like kind of hope for the best and trust the process. So I really appreciate it, the way that you articulated that. I'm gonna have to go back once this is out and listen to that again, just to get that little burst of hope, because it is.
I've had a lot of responses over the years, exactly like you're talking about.
Yeah,
you know, it's like,
yeah.
Well, I'm suffering, I'm going through pain, and it's interesting because while what you said about there being a certain degree of privilege is often the case, I know for me, I was in the depth of poverty and despair. There was no privilege.
I hear that too.
I was barely eating at the time when I woke up. So that kind of went into that. But it comes down to the fact that regardless of how empathetic you might be, regardless of how in tune you are, somebody who is hurting, somebody who is not in a state where they are healing, but they are still looking for the cause of their hurt, isn't going to hear you. They're going to try and make you into what they need you to be. And that has nothing to do with you. There's nothing you can do about that except to continue to empathize and go, if I need to be the villain for you right now, then so be it.
Oof, that's good. Allowance, just allowing it, just trusting the process. Even that we can cling to, right? Like, wait, no, don't make me the villain. Like, this is not my shit to deal with, but it's also like, okay, well, even that is a level of clinging to identity within oneself that if you let go of, there's some more freedom and empathy to be had there.
But it's not easy. I remember my wife and I got invited to somebody's house when I was much younger and I was waking up, and I wasn't nearly as patient as I am now. And at one point in the conversation, his wife looked at me and she's like, I just hate it when you speak. And that pretty much set the tone for the rest of the evening. And it was just because I was so adamant about what I was saying that I wasn't recognizing that it was causing her discomfort because it was so far outside of where she was. And we covered this in a previous episode that, it's one thing to be insightful. It's another thing to be insightful and not know how to build bridges, right? Because if you can't find a way from where you are to where they are, it doesn't do any good. And all you end up seeming is like somebody who's aloof, and somebody who's beyond their problems that can't possibly understand. Because when we're in pain, while it's not the case that our pain is special, it certainly feels special.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's that identification.
Absolutely. Yeah. With the bridge building aspect of that, like some people almost, it seems like they don't care whether they do or don't. And it's like, is there something? Yeah, absolutely. But even in the conversation of like, well, if they're not at my level, like I don't need to get to their level. And it's like, are you really seeing this connectivity that you have to everything, or are you missing it? Are you missing that connection? Do you still see yourself as separate if you don't recognize that connection, that bridge that is already there. There's already a bridge. You don't have to build a bridge. You just have to recognize it. So if you can't recognize it, are you missing some of that point? And I think too, with the empathy side of it and the judgment side of it, for me, the recognition that, if I were to trade atom for atom, experience for experience with someone else, like I would do the same exact thing that they would do. I would make the same exact decision they would make. I would say the same exact thing that they would say. So through that, it doesn't mean, that you have to agree with everyone and be like, oh yeah, I would do the same thing. So sure. Yeah, that's fine. It's like, no, you have a different experience. You have different atoms going on and whatever, some semblance of though you're not separate, a different perspective or however you want to say it. So you can utilize that perspective in order to help with the ripples in those who may not see that clarity. Though you would do the same thing that they would, it doesn't mean that you can't disagree and work towards shifting some perspective through your experience. And I think that helps a lot because so many people are so quick to package people up and put them in a box and be like, oh, I would never do that because I'm a good person and they're a bad person, something like that. So the initial thing after this, you can do whatever you want, but initially recognize that you would do the same thing that they would if you were in their shoes, same atoms, same experiences, same past, same upbringing and everything. If you can recognize that, you can act through so much more clarity through that empathy and lack of initial knee-jerk judgment. It's not to say that I judge things in people all the time. It's like, it's not this super easy thing to do all the time, but in that recognition, there's a lot more clarity for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's so beautifully articulated. I think you're absolutely right. And again, there's so much empathy to everything that we're saying here, which I really just value, but, kind of related to that, I've been playing with this practice lately that has been really transformative in helping me shift into that perspective that you were just talking about. I wish I had the full quote in front of me, but Pema Chodron has this quote. She says something to the effect of, behind all rigidity of the heart, and within that, I think she would include like anxiety or knee-jerk reactions, behind all of that is fear. And if you can get to the fear and touch the fear, like approach it without your own fear, you'll find a soft place behind it. And I'm for some reason that quote just like punched me in the gut, and I was like, what is that? And I just found myself rolling it over like a Werther's caramel in my mouth, like for days. And I thought, I feel like this could be a very applicable practice. And so I started doing it multiple times a day to myself, where if I felt a knee-jerk reaction to something, if I felt any even small wave of anxiety or stress or rigidity or defensiveness, I would immediately pause. And luckily I work from home, so this is very easy to do just in my own space. I would pause and I would really allow myself to feel that rigidity, whatever form that it was taking. And then ask myself, okay, where is the fear behind that? And it's immediately, at least for me, and I mean, I have had a contemplative practice for a long time, but immediately the fear just bubbles to the surface when you ask for like, what's behind that? And then noticing, okay, here's this fear. And again, this phrase I say to myself, like, oh, of course, that's like a reasonable fear to have. Of course, that's something that you'd be afraid of. And then again, would ask, okay, where's the soft place behind that? And that part felt the most abstract. Like, what does that even mean? But when I asked myself that, like, okay, where's the soft place behind that fear? Again, immediately a sort of answer would bubble to the surface. And it's been so interesting to do that within my own self, to pause that reactivity to other people, especially. People just have a way of poking at us. It's just such a fun part of being human. It really helped pause my own reactivity. But then the more I played with it, the more I realized I could identify that in other people. Speaking of like this unity that we have with other people, I would see people, like now I can see, and it's a newer practice for me, but when I'm intent on it, if someone responds to me with rigidity, anxiety, anger, insecurity, I don't know, whatever else, I want to have my own reaction to that and meet them from that place of rigidity. But if I can pause and ask myself, like, okay, where might their fear be behind that? I can't know for certain, but I can make some educated guesses as to where this rigidity or this anxiety or this like frustration is coming from, or their own knee-jerk reaction. I can imagine where that's coming from. can I see where also there might be a soft spot for them behind that, a desire? Often it's like the soft spot is a desire. Oh, your fear is a reflection of a desire that you have that you're afraid isn't going to take place. Often, right? Like as humans, a desire for connection. And if I can find that soft place, I can come into my own soft place and meet their rigidity with that level of softness and empathy and understanding, and a sort of recognition, as you were saying, Andrew, that like, oh yeah, if I was in your shoes, I would through the desire, find the fear and react in that rigidity. I would probably do the same thing. And then if I can meet them from that softer place below all of that built up identity and built up, rigidity and all that stuff, it's so wild because I thought that would be in some way something that would make me feel less powerful. Like I was like, oh, I'll just be the softer one, like, and in some way concede to them being the an angry, powerful one or something. But it's like so wild. The more I do that and respond to people in that way, they'll just like melt and come right down. Most of the time, melt down and come to that softness. We'll meet in that place together. And I feel like in practice, what you were just saying, Andrew, looks like that in practice for me. I'm like, okay, how do I actually take this desire to not just have this knee-jerk reaction, to have this empathy for where other people are coming from, and to not force them to see things from my perspective or force something else on them. But meeting in that place allows for this completely different energetic exchange that just, I think, is really, really allows that situation to be shifted for both of us. And in a way, back to what you were saying, Ray, too, that sort of collective sense of like, in some weird way, me deciding to take that path allows me to shift the collective energetic exchange that we're having, which is just so powerful. It's so wild.
It is. It's interesting. What you were saying kind of reminded me of something that Krishnamurti said about recognizing fear, about rather than looking for the reasons that we're afraid, looking at the fact of our fear. I'm afraid. Just for what it is, without judgment or preconception, just to look at it. Right. And that kind of did the same thing for me, in that as soon as I could see I was just staring at fear, then I could start to remove that fear just by looking at it, right? And that allowed me to get to that soft spot behind it, or that point of vulnerability, of clarity. I wasn't just staring at the illusion anymore. And then later on, when I took Wing Chun, it became a difference in application, because in karate and taekwondo and a bunch of other martial arts, it's very rigid, right? Your muscles are very rigid. It's like hitting somebody with an iron bar. But in Wing Chun, your hands are almost always open. You're very soft in Wing Chun. And so when a punch comes blazing in, you actually kind of meet it and just let it tell you where it's going. And that became a different way of dealing with other people's fear. All of a sudden it was, I'm not in danger. I'm like outside of, there may be some physical altercation as a result of this person's mentality. My state of being's not in danger. I'm not threatened by it. Right. And so I can be there for that person. But as long as I'm protecting myself, as long as I'm doing this, I'm not in the conversation.
Right. Oh, that's a powerful visual. Yeah, I totally resonate with that.
Yeah, something I feel like this sort of way that this has come out for me, especially personally, but it's also applicable to other people too. Like my perception of other people is just asking why. Like when something comes up, like I'm super nervous for, a presentation or something, and it's like, why are you nervous? Because I want to do a good job. Why do you want to do a good job? Because I want people to have a positive perception of me. Why do you want people to have a positive perception of you? Because I want, more friends or something. And there comes a point along that line, like, why do you want more friends? I already have enough friends. I don't really need more friends. And there comes a point along that path where it's like, that one doesn't really make sense because you don't really care about that. You just kind of assume, because it's been your nature for so long. And maybe in the past you didn't have as many friends or something, like when you were younger, something like that. And that's sort of bubbling up, and you're so used to over the years, it's kind of like the game of telephone, that there was a deeper reason further back, but it's not really applicable anymore, but it's still in that same situation, sort of bubbles up. So literally just asking why, and like, kind of like little kids do, like, why is the sky blue? because, the water's, or why is the water blue? Because the sky is blue, or stuff like that. And it's like, why? And it's like, gets really annoying eventually, and then eventually parents are just like, oh, it's just the way it is. And that kind of ends it for the most part. And people in society do that quite a bit too, to not have to continue questioning things. But yeah, I found that to be a sort of similar type of practice of just kind of getting to the deeper roots of that, to eventually the point, like, I why myself to death. And then it's like or why my fear to death. And it's like, there's a part that doesn't make as much sense. And then it's like, oh,
right.
so there isn't really as much to worry about. And also, like, the other side of that is with nerves or something like that. It's like being able to sit and just recognize that, kind of like Ray was saying, just see it and be like, I don't have to get rid of this. I can just see it. I can feel it. I can be nervous and still do a good job. There's nothing saying that they have to be mutually exclusive. That was the main key for me. Like 4 years ago, when I recognized that, all of a sudden it wasn't about getting rid of the nerves, because I used to get very, very nervous and I would always try and suppress them. And that whole idea of what you resist persists. So it would never go away. It would only get worse. And then as soon as I started accepting it, being like, I'm nervous right now, I'm worried, whatever, and that's okay. And then all of a sudden it's like, it just kind of like settles into the reality of the moment. So between those two things, they've definitely helped me a lot with that.
Oh man, that was a gift I would love to give everyone, the ability and the sort of willingness to sit with what we're feeling long enough to realize it doesn't have the power that we think it does, that we've assigned to it. Yeah, that's such a beautiful lesson. A hard one. I mean, it's it takes a lot of years of unpacking, that belief that, like, if I feel this way, it means this, or this will happen as a result of that, or whatever else we have tied up in that. But to be able to sit with that long enough to see, like, oh, if I just sit here and recognize it and give it the space to be for 90 seconds, it'll dissipate. Or maybe it'll persist, and then I just still do the thing, and then I'm like, oh, I felt that, and I still was able to go forward with a job interview, with a speaking engagement, or whatever it was. So that's I think about that a lot on this journey. Like, there are certain things I come across like that, I'm like, oh, I wish I could give that to everyone. Like, I wish I could just like plug that in to the updated iOS.
Yeah, I hear you. And it's funny though, because if I could go back and talk to my teenage self wouldn't have listened to me. And that's the stark reality, because I wasn't in a mindset to see the benefit of what I was saying. And I know when I transitioned into life coaching, which I stepped away from for a while, I'm doing it here and there now. It was very much just about getting people to a point where they recognize the benefit of questioning themselves, or they recognize the benefit of not immediately believing their emotional state of mind, or their knee-jerk perception of things, just to question it and then go out in the world. Because as soon as they do, like, I used to try and cheer people up in a life coaching session, which is a terrible thing to do. Don't do that, right? Just allow them to cheer themselves up, right? Allow them to lift that weight off, because that's what cheers them up. It's not you being pleasant. It's you helping them realize that the weight they're carrying doesn't have to be there. And that was it. It's just like, okay, let's get you to a point where you can take that weight off and see what it feels like. And then that did the work. It's just the feeling. It's the exposure to that other way of living. As soon as they feel that, it's like, I want more of that. But you can't like lead them to it. They have to feel it first.
Yeah. Oh, no, you're absolutely right. I was just talking to a friend, in fact, who recently did immersion therapy. She had a severe fear that she's dealt with for most of her life. And she finally sought out a specialist and did immersion therapy. And she let me ask her about it, because I was like, I've never, aside from whatever that show was where they used to do that to people, a reality show. Do you remember that, where they would like submerge you in a tank of tarantulas just like to help you get over it? That's what it's called. Okay. Yeah. What a weird, humans are so weird. The entertainment we come up with. Anyway, but I was asking about her experience, and that's the main part of that experience actually had less to do with immersion and more to do with her being trained that she could sit with severe discomfort and learn that it's not as bad as she had made it out to be. And that not only was it not as bad as she could make it out to be, but she was much more capable of handling whatever came up than she also thought she was. So there's like all these constructs that we have that keep us locked there. I think that's so beautiful. And honestly, that's yeah, that learning that we can sit with uncertainty and the discomfort of uncertainty or discomfort of our own fears or emotions, for me is like a huge pull toward meditation. I mean, I don't know if either of you practice regularly, but I am Ray's laughing. I get the sense that you've practiced many forms of meditation over your years, Ray.
That's one way to put it, for sure.
Well, now I'm curious about all that too, but I don't know about you both, but I don't know. Meditation is so often pitched as something that's like good for activating your parasympathetic nervous system, and it's going to help you lower stress, and it's going to help lower your blood pressure. It has all of these sort of like medical, like, okay, Americans, like, here's why you should meditate. And none of those were ever appealing to me, but the few times that I would meditate early on, there was just something interesting about it. And I remember being like, this is so boring. And yet some part of me is like, let's go back though and do that again. And I think one experience that I finally realized it was so beneficial for is exactly what you're just addressing, Ray, about like really teaching ourselves that we are capable of sitting with discomfort, are far more capable than we realize that we are. And I mean, one really easy way to teach yourself that is sitting in boredom. Like sitting in meditation, being bored is like uncomfortable. It's a minor discomfort, but it is uncomfortable. And then you realize like, oh, that's not that bad. And then once you make it through the boredom, like other things come up and you're like, oh, I guess I can sit through that too. So I'm really grateful to meditation for serving as a really simple, accessible, in a way, easy, in another way, terrifyingly challenging, opportunity to practice that. And beyond that, just to explore consciousness. Like there's so much there when you get quiet. That's so fascinating. But yeah, again, another gift I wish I could give everyone, just the realization that like, oh, this discomfort that I want to run from, whatever that looks like, is actually not what I've made it up to be, not what I've created it as.
Yeah. I feel like when there's, when you get to a point where you're comfortable in discomfort, it's like, is there still discomfort then if you're comfortable in it? And it's like, we could probably argue that, but it's similar to if you're not afraid of being afraid, if you're not afraid of all those feelings that you've always been so afraid of happening, it's like, is there anything to worry about then? If you've sat in those feelings that you've always been so afraid of and realize and sort of like come out the other side and recognize that you're totally fine. You're still alive. You're still breathing. All of a sudden there's less of that getting worried about feeling worried or getting nervous about feeling nervous, because if you get nervous about feeling nervous, then you get nervous about feeling nervous about getting nervous about feeling nervous, and it's like this endless cycle until you recognize that it's okay to be nervous or it's okay to be uncomfortable. And then all of a sudden there isn't that fear sort of leading up to it. And there is an acceptance for whenever it arises, because those feelings, that was the thing too, is like a big thing for me was I was always growing up like pretty quiet. And especially in high school, just like had a pretty big fear of like public speaking and just putting myself out there. And I always thought, and now it's like not something I worry about, but I always thought that all of the people who were really good public speakers or whatever, like they never got nervous. It was like my thinking was, oh, I just have to never get nervous and then I'll be fine. Like if I just get to a point, I read enough books, watch enough videos, and I'm not nervous leading up to it, then I'll be good. Then I'll be great. And it wasn't that. I recognized over the last 5-6 years, it was okay. It was always the whole time that I was so afraid of it. Like there was nothing wrong with that. It was just the doing of it that was going to get me to it. It was feeling that and doing it anyway, not avoiding it and trying to overcome that initial feeling. It was like, no, feel afraid and then go do it and be like, oh, wow, it's never, ever in my entire life been nearly as bad as I thought it was going to be. And then eventually, you do it so many times that fear leading up to it just like gets a little smaller and a little smaller. And, I still, for certain, whatever thing coming up, sometimes get some nerves, and it's an immediate, just like, I'm a little nervous right now, and that's okay. Sometimes I'm grateful when I'm a little bit nervous as opposed to not nervous at all, because it gives me sort of like some energy for it. And some, it's almost like an excitement, even though I'm kind of portraying it as nerves. It's like, I'm kind of happy that they're there, because it's like, all right, this is something that's going on here that's making me a little uncomfortable. That means there's opportunity to learn and get better at something that I'm still uncomfortable with.
There's a good quote from Bruce Lee. Don't pray for an easy life, pray for the strength to deal with a hard one. And it's words to live by, right? Because if you're always expecting things to live up to your expectations, you're always going to be in frustration. You're always going to be in conflict, right? Whereas if you have the ability to roll and align and adapt, then you can make the most out of pretty much any situation. But what I found really interesting was you were talking about meditation, about how when we sit and we're still, that discomfort comes up, and there's a benefit to sitting through that discomfort. And I would say that that is actually what we're always dealing with, because we're talking about when people react, when they defend themselves in a knee-jerk fashion to protect their identity and all of that. Well, what are they doing? They're avoiding the uncertainty of the stillness that would have come before that reaction. They could have sat, waited, created an entirely new reaction, but the uncertainty of that stillness made them reach for a previous one, made them reach for something they've used before. So it's always the same stillness that makes us uncomfortable, whether we're meditating or going to work.
For sure. I feel like I completely agree with what you're saying. And I think, again, not to put everyone on blast and really push meditation on anyone, but I feel like that's exactly it. You start to get comfortable with that stillness and recognizing, oh, if I can do this here, I could do this anywhere in life. It's like, and then the practice becomes mobile. It's just wherever you are, there you are, right? You're practicing sort of as you go. Yeah, I love that. I think you're totally right. And if we can just learn that stillness isn't as terrifying as we make it out to be, you can hold on, as they say in Buddhism, like extend the gap so that you don't get hooked by that classic reaction, or that reaction that you have built in all of the time. And then beyond that, kind of circling back to what you were just saying, Andrew, too, I feel like what you're describing here is such an interesting perspective shift on how we view our experiences and the emotions that scare us at times. Like if we can look at, in your case, okay, nerves or something that used to terrify me, I need to get over them. Like I need to not have this nervousness. Then there's this sort of that what you were saying about resisting, what we resist, we persist. I feel like I've already quoted Pema Chodron once, but another quote from her is coming to mind. So why not? I love what she says about this. She says that to stay with that shakiness, to stay with that discomfort, like is the spiritual path. There's not getting out of it. It's recognizing, can I switch this and realize that anywhere that I feel stuck, anywhere that I feel afraid, anywhere that I feel like clinging to this reaction isn't something to actually be afraid of. What if I shifted my perspective and saw, if I'm seeing that I'm stuck here, if I'm seeing that I'm having this specific reaction that I always have to this experience, that is a portal to unburdening myself a little bit more, to recognizing like, whoa, I'm really clinging to how I view that emotion. Or I'm really clinging to how I think that this experience is going to happen. The problem isn't the experience. The problem isn't my nerves. The problem isn't any of this. The problem is how I'm choosing to relate to that. And what if I could just flip the script and say like, here's a portal to me unburdening myself a little bit more from that clinging. Then all of a sudden that rigidity comes up, that anxiety, the nerves, whatever. And you're like, I'm in it. Like, this is it. This is what it's about, is like sitting with this. And that shifts what was terrifying into something that's like really beautiful and like such a lovely opportunity. And that shift alone, which took me admittedly a very long time to adopt. But that shift alone is, I feel, so powerful for shifting our own experience and the way that we relate to ourselves, to the world, to others. Well, they're not really others, as previously discussed ad nauseum, but that for another time. Yeah, it's just so powerful. And circling back to what you had said earlier, Ray, like we're talking about what these ripples, or really just taking personal responsibility for my experience in the world and trusting that will have an impact on this collective human experience. Like that's one of the inroads for me, taking that responsibility for how I'm relating to those situations.
Awareness changes the ripples, right? Like Andrew and I often talk about how just awareness of what is influences what is. I mean, that's how it goes, right?
Right, right.
Yeah, it's a really interesting journey. So I have a question for you, because often as a life coach, I've had people ask the question that, and this is in the same vein as our challenges are ultimately blessings when you start to look at them as opportunities to pick away at your conflict and your illusions. I've often had people in relationships say, like, I'm on a very conscious path. I feel like my partner is not. Can that work? And in my opinion, the idea that they're not is, first of all, an assumption that's often self-validating. And it's just that you don't understand necessarily what their path might be. But being in a relationship, especially because a relationship is so challenging as it goes on, can be a huge catalyst for growth. If you can apply the same lessons, if you can apply the same perceived needs as opposed to actual needs in your relationship with a romantic partner, they're an ongoing source of revelation. They're an ongoing source of insight, because they get to see your triggers. They know all of your buttons. And so living with them over time gives you those opportunities, where I've met a lot of people on a spiritual path who will avoid relationships. They will take the path of the singular person. And it's often because it's easier. It's just easier.
Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Oh man, I totally get, wait, I was so caught up in everything that you were saying and like hemming and hawing over here. I think I might have missed your question in there.
I don't think I actually asked it. I guess my question is,
well, that's fine,
because I know you are in a relationship, you have a partner that you host your podcast with. How has that developed over time? Have you found your partner to be as instrumental as a source of insight as your other day-to-day exercises? Or have you found that that's been a little bit more of a challenge to pull those insights out of those conversations because you're so close?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thank you for letting me ask what the question was. I'm glad we narrowed that down, because I was like, we could go a lot of different ways with this, Ray. I think that's such a great question. And I love getting to talk about this, because it's not something I really saw a lot of examples for growing up or even now. I'm almost curious to flip. I'm going to flip your question back on you, Ray, knowing that you were also in a partnership, and curious to hear your answer to that too. But oh my gosh, honestly, being in what I don't mean to label it, but being in conscious partnership has been one of the absolute biggest catalysts for continued growth, and really just like having a mirror so close, like you said, someone who knows your triggers, knows your buttons, pushes them, like, unintentionally. So for me, I really thought that I had healed a lot. I have a lot of religious and a lot of romantic relational trauma that I've had to work through and sort of like chip away at. Speaking of like these identities we build and these preconceived notions that we have around how we relate to other people, romantically or otherwise. I had a lot of healing work to do there. Just a lot of trauma to work through. But I thought I had healed. I thought I had really sifted through a lot of that on my own, and I had. But it's just so different, to your point. Like if any of us were to continue on a sort of single path, I think someone feels called to that, or like feels like that's what they want, so be it, to each their own. I just definitely would not have gone as deep and shed as many layers and learned new ways of relating if I had not been in partnership. And definitely I feel really grateful for it and see it as, again, just one of the biggest catalysts in my own process, in my own journey through all of not only the healing, but even just, I don't know, I don't really love the word awakening. And I don't think that there is one awakening, right? There's just like all these little blips of awakening moments that we have.
Ongoing.
But that has been, yeah, for sure. So that's been, my partnership has been huge and has really hugely impacted all of that. So early in relationship, found a lot of those triggers very deep, that where I couldn't even find them. And you let someone else in that close, like I would have gone forever if I had not been in partnership and just like not even known that they were there. You let someone in close, they find them. I had a lot of relational wounds, like I said, and so immediately led to a lot of my own healing. And I'm really grateful. My partner has a lot of patience and a lot of grace and gentleness and understanding for the human experience. So when I was like being triggered and having anxiety attacks, like we just started dating, it's supposed to be this like lovely early dating phase, and I'm like being triggered once a month and like having anxiety attacks that were really, it just left me so wrung out. And I'm really grateful. He had a lot of, like I said, patience and gentleness to not just be frustrated with that or like, why is this happening? But to be like, okay, let's look at this with some curiosity, like what's going on here. And I think really helped me find that gentleness toward myself in that process as well. So I now, it is honestly just, I mean, we still work through things regularly, right? But having really healed more thoroughly from a lot of those wounds, now it's just fun and really challenging sometimes. But now I'm like, oh, I have this other person who is as interested in me in exploring consciousness and having these intentionally expansive experiences, as he always calls them, and really like having these conversations. I mean, this is why we ended up starting our own podcast. I feel like we often joke, like everyone will be, sitting around a table and like, we should start a podcast. This conversation is great. But we were just sitting around the table all of the time, having these conversations and really like recognizing we didn't have a lot of examples of, again, what I would call maybe conscious partnership, or people who are having these conversations and digging in and thinking, I want to relate better than I saw. I love my parents. I would like to relate better than them. I think they would even want that for me. I would like to relate better in partnership and in friendship and in all these other relationships better than the examples that I see around me. Like, how do we translate all of this inner work that we're doing to unburden ourselves from these illusions that we create about our own identities, about other people's identities, about that separateness? How do we actually take all of that, like really sometimes heady consciousness exploring, like philosophical, really zoomed out conversations and bring those into like, okay, can we bring that down to earth though? Because we are having this experience, and I think we could just do it a lot better. I think that there's just a better way of doing all of that. So yeah, long story short, partnership for me has been very challenging, agitating, healing, beautiful, expansive. And I personally am an advocate for it in terms of like it helping you, serving as a mirror and helping you even explore your own snags and illusions and preconceived notions about yourself and about the world. So that's my experience of it. But again, Ray, I'm curious to turn the microphone back over to you and hear from your own experience being in partnership with all of this.
And then I'm going to pass it over to Andrew, because I know he's going through the mid-20s relationship thing in and out, having his own experience. And I just wanted to mention very quickly that as true as it is that your romantic partner will challenge you, if you have close friends who have known you for a long time, they will also challenge you. They will also push your buttons, for sure. For me, so my wife and I have been together for 18 years.
Wow.
When we first met, I was just waking up. Well, I'd been on this path, I guess, for a couple of years, and she was having a conflict with her chosen career path. She was going to counseling at the time when we met, and it was just because it didn't make sense to her in the way that she thought it should. She was in it for the wrong reason. She was doing it more or less because it was the path that she was told she should take, and there was all this respect and prestige and control and all this other stuff, but it was stressing her out. And so we met, and immediately my perspective kind of hit her over the head like a hammer, which was, there is no control, and really your life is the priority. Let's keep that in mind. You're trying to get a job, but if you're a wreck, how is that helping you? And so that was it. And then she, of course, started challenging me, because she came from a completely different way of life, upper middle class family. Her dad was in finance, blah, blah, blah. I was basically just coming off the street. So it was a very different mentality either way. And so she would challenge me and I would challenge her. And then for the first 3 months, she either left or I kicked her out every day. And then the next 3 months after that, it was every second day. And then it stopped being arguments. It started being, right, we've been here. Oh, okay, we know where we're getting tripped up. Oh, okay, I can understand why I'm reacting that way. And it was because we didn't avoid them. We never went into the relationship with the idea that if we argue, that is a sign of the end times. It was, this is what happens when two beings come into a relationship with one another that don't resonate the same way. it takes some time for them to find that equal resonance, just like two tuning forks, right? So that was the mentality we went into the relationship with. And then about a year later, I said, I have to leave. I'm sorry. I'm at this point in my journey where I just can't be around people or anything that I attach to for comfort or security. I'm running away to go live in the forest. And she said, oh, I'm going to come with you. And so we sold all our stuff and we built a shack in the woods, and we lived in that shack for about 8 months. And in that 8 months, we really found all of the trigger points, all of them, because nothing says stress and anxiety like being cold and wet and hungry with no shower or hot water or anything else. And so that set the template. And then ever since then, we've always been on the same footing in terms of we know who each other are. We know who we are, regardless of how we're acting at any given point. Like if it's a bad day, it's like, all right, I'll see you in an hour when you're through that, right? Because then you're going to be back. Right now, all I'm dealing with is what you're going through. And that's important to remember too with relationships with people. Sometimes you're talking to them. Sometimes you're talking to what they're going through. Very different conversation, right? So just want to pass this off to Andrew, because I know Andrew has a largest family as well as an extensive friend network. Not something that I can relate to, in all honesty, because I've always moved. I've always been transient. I don't have much of a family. And so I'm curious, Andrew, do you find that to be the same thing, where you're often getting challenged, in either respectful or disrespectful ways by the people who are closest to you? And do you find that's helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. I was initially going to say, like, I'm not currently in a romantic relationship, but definitely since sort of last summer, and especially questioning a lot of things, just talking about this stuff, but my family has been involved in a lot of that. And even myself, like, I think, people talk about the people who are closest to you have the deepest history with you. Like, or what is the saying? Like, if you think you're enlightened, go spend a weekend with your parents or something like that. And I spent a decent amount of time with my parents. They live down in Florida now, so especially in the winter in New York, I like to get down there here and there. And my family's very close. We've always have been, but we also have a deep history. And then what I've found is that I will definitely react and say things that I don't necessarily mean looking back at it, and get caught up in identification and triggers and whatnot. But something I've found also is that we're very quick to forgive and kind of understand that there's this like base sort of layer of love. And we have had points when I was younger where we'd let stuff kind of fester for a little bit, but it rarely went past like the night. Like when everyone was going to bed, when I was growing up, like, and we were all living in the same house, it would be like things were forgiven before you went to sleep, because no one liked sleeping with those sorts of feelings. So it's been funny. And now it's just like very quick within, a couple hours of that. But on the friend side of it, it's also been interesting because some of my friends are intrigued in it, and I've had some. I think what did your partner call them, Ariel? Conscious, expansive experiences.
Intentionally expansive experiences.
Yeah, I've had a few of those with some of my close friends, some who have never, done any sort of psychedelics or anything like that, and that's been very interesting. And I've even had. One of my best friends, I've had conversations with him. This was like back in August. So like I kind of started to realize and talk about this stuff more back in July of 2021. And I was, explaining to him, like, you are not this name that you have identified with. And it was a night out, like we were visiting some friends in Philadelphia, and he was just, it was like, I don't know, midnight probably. And we were on our way to the bars, and he was just like very gung ho in his thing. And I was, I had a couple of beers and was ready to like just talk about it for hours. And so that was fun and didn't really get through to him. And then actually we took some mushrooms together and back in this past winter, and it was like an awesome time, and we had a great conversation. And he slowly but surely has sort of been able to recognize some of the things that I was talking about and be able to apply it to his life. And we talk about that now, and it's a much more open dialogue. And a lot of things he's like, I don't necessarily fully understand it. But I think the beauty of this and the conversation that we're having, Ariel, you just mentioned how it's the importance of it is the applicability. Like, as great as it is to go super deep and be able to have these conversations with people that really have grasped it, it's equally as important, if not more important, for sort of like our collective understanding to allow it to be applicable and see those bridges and see those opportunities to relate to someone that may not have full clarity of what you mean when you say, I am you. It's like there's levels to it. And I think recognizing that has been very helpful for me, and being able to keep that in mind. And anytime you think that, oh, you know, you don't get it and I'm not going to be on your level, it's like you are perceiving duality there. You are perceiving some separation if you are not able to recognize that there are levels to this conversation. So that's helped as well. But it's been interesting, especially with close friends and family. But it's been fun too, because I don't think you could ask probably anyone from my high school if they, you know, you were to say that Andrew would like be on social media and have followers on stuff, like I'd probably be one of the last person they would have thought, because I was extremely quiet and extremely reserved in high school. But it's fun now because I'll have people reach out to me, and people, maybe I wasn't super close to them in high school, but now I'll get DMs from them asking questions about the situation they're going through. And so it's fun to, I don't know, in a sort of full circle sort of way, see that. But it's just, I don't know, I love having conversations. So I've gotten better about not necessarily pushing it or pushing my viewpoint and sort of seeking some disagreement, but just allowing it to happen naturally more so. And if someone's open to it, then being willing to, because I'm always super willing to talk about this for sure.
Yeah. Oh, I love hearing about that experience with your friends, and yeah, it's so lovely to explore all of this on our own, and even in the context, like virtually getting to connect with you too. It's like we could talk for hours about it. I mean, we've been going for a while now. I'm like, we could just keep going. Let me just like refill my drink real quick and we'll just keep at it. But it's so different when the people that are in your life, you know, you get to go there with, and in some ways, like bring all of this down to earth. Not that it's not on earth. I of course mean that as a metaphor in terms of like, okay, like, yeah, the practical element of it. Like, okay, what would this look like to live this way? And to have the people that we share, you know, immediate air with, be in that conversation with themselves and with us as well, to further that sense of unity by being able to go there together. So that's really beautiful. I'm glad that you're able to experience and explore that with your friends too. I feel that, and it's fun to, I don't know. It took me a while to find among my friends, like not everyone was like, they were like, what are you talking about? And then you find people who are like ready, and you're like, okay, cool, like we can go there. But it's kind of interesting to navigate, especially early on in that path when you're like, but I'm so excited, like just look at it this way. Anyway, yeah. So I love hearing about your experience there.
And it's good to have a certain degree of, I guess, patience. So for me, because I came just straight out of hell, and in this isolated mentality, I went right off the deep end. As soon as I discovered freedom, it was like, sweet, I'm not going to waste any time. I'm going to start flying with this. And so I started introducing myself to people as God, just to start the conversation, just to get into it. It's like, hi, how you doing? I'm God. And
wait, would you really do that? Is that real?
Yes.
Oh my gosh, that's so awesome. I feel like I've
met
people like you earlier in my life, and when I didn't understand it, and I was like, why is that person? I love that. That's fantastic.
But okay, it ruffles a lot of feathers, right? It ruffles a lot of feathers. And as I started to realize that it was less about telling anybody anything and more about recognizing it myself, which is why I ultimately left YouTube at one point, those conversations got easier. It wasn't necessarily, hi, I'm God, but hi, I'm not anything you think I am. And we go from there. And so the conversation started to change. And I found that, again, my own peace changed how I brought that across to people. And I find that talking to Andrew, since we started this podcast in September, I think the first time we talked was in August, his way of communicating has changed. Sorry, Andrew, that's just something I've noticed over the time that we've been talking to one another. And it's because he embodies more of a state of peace in everything he does. And there's more of fluidity to it in general. And so the reason I'm asking this, because I want to return back to our previous conversation about meditation shortly before we end this podcast episode, because you teach meditation. Now, meditation is something that I have taught before. I've helped people learn how to meditate, but I've always avoided certain styles of meditation because I often felt that it was attaching to another narrative. It was attaching to another creation in the mind. So I'm very curious as to what style of meditation you recommend or what style of meditation you practice for yourself. And is that something that you can do on the fly, say taking a city bus when you're frustrated or at work or something along those lines?
Yeah. That's a great question. I think overall too, I'm loving this common thread throughout this conversation of sort of holding things with open hands really lightly, whether that's like conversations we want to have with our friends and like not like jumping on them, like you said, not just flying with the freedom and being like, let's just run into everyone with this, or constructions of our own conceptions of ourselves, or I mean, really everything, right? And I feel like meditation is similar. There are a lot of types of meditation. Even for me, like part of my own deconstruction around Christianity, I was so ready to shed any semblance of ritual and any semblance of like dogmatic practices. And the more I've come, as you just addressed, like the more I've come to my own peace with even that faith system and everything else and a lot of other things, right? All of a sudden I'm like, oh, wait, ritual is actually really beautiful when held lightly, you know, when you're not putting everything on it, and recognizing this is a symbol. I'm signaling to myself something by doing this. So I think when it comes to meditation, whatever method or whatever approach you're taking, whatever type of practice you're doing, holding it lightly is so important to not get caught in that, at least in my own experience, for sure. I practice a few different styles of meditation. I mostly studied within the lineage of Tibetan Buddhism. And so a lot of the meditation is focused on really intentionally focusing the attention of the mind on an object. So that object could be your breath. That's obviously a very common one. The attention could be on a visualization. The object of your attention could be on something more broad. So right now, my favorite application of that, my favorite type of meditation is generally called open awareness within the Tibetan Buddhist lineage. So practically what that looks like, you know, is I'll close my eyes, do the whole thing. I'll sort of almost scan the space around me and observe, like imagine the space that's in front of me between where I'm sitting and the wall in front of me, between where I'm sitting and the wall next to me. And like observing as I go about that process, the sounds that are in that space. And I think that you two might both appreciate this. There's a sense of expansiveness, of expanding sort of your conscious awareness to that space. All of a sudden, my thoughts aren't in my head. They're not in my being. I can see my thoughts as taking place in this greater space around me. And I find that practice to be so both liberating and very interesting. If I can all of a sudden expand my perception of my own consciousness to be, I live in a massive studio. So like in this big studio space, a lot bigger than my brain. Like on a very practical level, I'm like, this is a different size than we're normally in, you know, like of space. And that kind of exploration I find to be really interesting. And just allowing my thoughts to be recognized as another thing that's in that space, not something that I need to attach to or identify with too much. So that's my current favorite type of meditation, just because I really enjoy that expansive state. And it really has helped me further detach from, like, I still get lost in thought. And then I'm like, oh yeah. And then I imagine that thought kind of in the space around me. And then it's like, oh, it's not as important as I thought it was. It's just like another floating object in a way. So I think that helps with that gap that we were talking about, extending between a stimulus and that knee-jerk reaction. By seeing that expansiveness of my awareness, I can kind of like let things float and then choose whether I'm engaging with them or not. And some days that's easier than others. Some days I just sit there and like, I'm just distracted the whole entire time. That's allowed too. That's like part of it. It's like, okay, what's my mind like today? It's really busy. That's what's going on in my mind.
There's a quote from a book called Lazy Man's Guide to Enlightenment. I've shared this before, but if you find yourself being resistant, don't resist your resistance.
Yeah, and then chew on that for a while. That'll really expand you a little bit.
Absolutely. That's a really interesting practice in terms of meditation, because that's just basically the same thing that I do, which is just paying attention. You're just paying attention and getting your mind out of the illusion. What I find interesting is that when you do that expansive meditation, there's almost this point where eventually it comes and you go, right, there is no room outside my awareness. Everything's me. And so suddenly there's no internal, external, and meditation becomes, well, kind of trippy. In general,
absolutely.
Because, now you're going down the paradoxical road. So that's great. I'm really glad that you shared that with us, because I know a lot of people have been asking about meditation, different meditation practices. And I think that what you just identified there is that it's not necessarily about the practice so much as the intention and the clarity that goes behind it. You mentioned earlier that meditation is often kind of sold to us as having this benefit and this benefit and this benefit and this benefit. And I always feel like there should be a caveat there, almost like at the end of a medication commercial. It's like, may not work if you're focused on these benefits, because it changes the entire reason that you're meditating. Right. So it's an interesting catch-22. I'm just going to pass this over to Andrew here to see if he has any questions or last-minute thoughts on meditation before we wrap up this episode. And I just wanted to say thank you quickly before we get towards the conclusion, because this has been such a fun conversation. I've really enjoyed this. Andrew?
Yeah, likewise. And with on the meditation stuff and just the ritual and shedding of rituals, and then seeing it as this sort of potential for beauty as well. Like I went through a very stark sort of in and out and back in of that this past fall, because growing up I was very rigid and like very structured, very goal oriented, always had something that I was striving for, whether it was to play a sport in college or go to a certain college or get this grade or do this thing. Like so many people, it's kind of like how our entire childhood is structured. It's based on that. So I saw when I sort of recognized that I wasn't this idea, this concept, there wasn't as much striving to do necessarily, because there wasn't this inherent feeling of lack that I needed to fill through accomplishment. So I very much went from being super structured to like not structured at all. And I always had a very rigid morning routine. And so then I went to like no structure whatsoever, like barely kept a to-do list. Like for work I would, because I didn't want to get fired, but I would go to sleep when I got tired. I would wake up when I woke up, like I wasn't setting alarms. And so I did that for, I don't know, maybe 2 months. And then I realized, I do have a lot of opportunities, and it's not that I have to do anything in order to fill this void or feel more whole and complete, because I knew inherently that I was whole and complete right now, every single moment. But it was like I was able to come full circle and see that, there is an actual use for this structure and for this routine to allow me to do the things that I enjoy and do the things that I want to do. So instead of coming at it from a place of need and from a place of inherent lack, it was coming at a place of like, I am whole now, but utilizing these structures and these routines will allow me to do more stuff. Because I found a lot of times when I had no structure, I would sit here and just scroll on TikTok for like an hour. And I'm like, what is that really? Is that really what I want to be doing? Or is that just what is like the easiest thing for my instant gratification in the moment? So being able to then sort of reincorporate structure, now there's so much more awareness and sort of intent behind the structure, as opposed to just doing it because I always had, and I had this sort of need to accomplish those things in order to feel better about myself. It was being able to utilize it with more intention. So I definitely resonated with that. And then for meditation, for me, like I did do a very rigid, along with, the morning routine for about 3 years, like meditating every single day, sitting down with my eyes closed. And I don't do that anymore, but it's not to say that I don't meditate. It's almost just like the line between those 10, 20 minutes I would set aside and the rest of my
Yeah.
day just got kind of blurred. And so now it's
Mm-hmm.
like I'm always catching when thoughts are arising and just being aware, remembering I'm not what I think I am, remembering that I don't know
Right.
what's going to happen beyond this moment. So it's like, instead of taking that, set aside time, I just do other things in that time, and I'm able to sort of do life as the meditation all the time. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's been sort of my shift in both the structure and shedding of that, and then on the
Yeah.
meditation side. But yeah, so I
Yeah.
resonate with that a lot for sure.
Yeah, yeah, that sounds like a really integrated practice, like really bringing it. I mean, again, that's the practicality of all of it. It's like we have these practices, but they're really just in a way reshaping how we engage with all of our experiences in total. And Ray, back to part of your question that I didn't answer, like you're like, can I do this on a bus when I'm frustrated? Can I do this whenever? It's like, yeah, you can. Like at any moment, I like to say, like, if I'm home meditating, I usually do it in the morning before my partner's awake. But if he's awake, I'm like, feel free to like make noise, make coffee, do whatever. Like the more distractions, the more I have to work with. So if you're on a bus or if you're like at work or like whatever the thing is, it's like, it might be a little extra challenging, but like, it's also good for some extra practice too. So integrating that, I love that, Andrew. I think it's when you can start to see like all of our experiences as an opportunity to be present and to notice and be aware of what's going on in the mind without latching onto it and letting it dictate how we engage. That's it.
And it's funny because it not only does it inform our insights and our level of alignment, but it informs our empathy. Going through these challenges, going through
Right.
these uncertainties, they immediately make it easier for us to recognize ourselves in someone else. I was having this conversation with my daughter recently because she's 14 and she's dealing with
Mm.
other teenagers and stuff like that. And I reminded her, just like you're uncertain about who you are and your value and the world and what's right and living up to expectations, I'm like, so
Mm.
are your friends. And so what you're
Yeah.
dealing with from them is that fear, that reaction to that uncertainty. And not everybody has been raised to embrace uncertainty to the same degree. And so you have to recognize
Yeah.
that. But can you without feeling uncertainty yourself? And that's ultimately
Mm.
it, right? So this
Yeah,
has been
that's
a
good.
fantastic conversation. We're just going to keep talking if I don't eventually end this. What I'm hoping is that we can have you back on the show again at some point, as well as your partner, because you both
Yeah.
do an excellent job on your podcast. I've only caught the one episode,
Aw.
but anybody who's listening, definitely go and check that out. If you could just let everybody know how they can reach you. Do you have a YouTube channel at the moment, or is it just the podcast?
Yeah, good question. I don't have a YouTube right now, just the podcast and social, that sort of thing. But yeah, first of all, I just want to say thank you both so much for having me. This has been such a lovely conversation, and you both have expanded my own perspectives in the last 2 hours that we've been here. So thank you for the time. I really feel like we could just keep it going for a while, but I know we all have lives. So thank you for having me, and thanks for all of the kindness and the expansion and all that good stuff. I really value these conversations. So thank you for having it with me. Thank you for sharing it with the world. Thanks for being that ripple. If there even is a ripple, that's, another conversation though. And now back to your question. Yeah, you can find me on TikTok or Instagram at Ariel Here and Now. And then, yeah, my partner and I host a podcast called Do You Have Space? You can check that out at doyouhave.space. Or if you're feeling old school, doyouhavespace.com will also work. And we also host weekly meditations and conversations. So if anybody's interested, I love especially getting to talk to people who are a little bit earlier in their journey and they're just kind of discovering this and they're like wanting to be around other people and maybe don't have those people. We also have people who've been on this path for a long time. So it's a lovely, beautiful mixed group of people with different experiences. And we hang out every Sunday to meditate and to have a conversation about all this good stuff. So all of that information, again, can be found at doyouhave.space. Thank you both again so much.
I was honestly very excited to have you here. I know Andrew and I were talking about your content and particularly, again, your intention, the clarity that you come across with, but mostly it's it's the consciousness behind your content that really caught our attention, because a lot of people talk about this stuff, but it's lip service, and you can tell it's lip service. It's like, I read all of this in a book, and now I'm telling you, pay me for life coaching. Whereas when I'm watching your content, I can feel the intensity. I can feel that it's coming from you. It's your insight that you've worked for, that you're cultivating, and that you're applying to your life. And I find, we talk about ripples, we've talked about it through this entire episode. I find that authenticity, it can't be faked. You can tell when somebody is actually seeing more and more of how they are one with everything, as opposed to just following the belief that they are one with everything. And so from my perspective, I just wanted to say thank you for joining us for this episode. I've been looking forward to it for like 3 weeks.
Yeah. Thank you for reflecting that back, Ray. That is so lovely to hear reflected back. So thank you for seeing that and for saying. And I could thank you for all the same. And if I don't stop, I'm going to keep thanking you over and over. So I'm just going to rein it in.
Yeah, no, likewise, just to echo Ray, it exceeded any expectations I may have had coming into this conversation. I've resonated with a lot of your videos for sure. And it's been very fun to have a more expanded conversation and to be able to touch on all of these things. So yeah, thank you again for joining us. And I hope that we can have another conversation very soon.
I'd love that.
Excellent. And that is it for this week. So for everybody listening, definitely do contact us on social media if you have any questions for the upcoming Q&A episode that will be happening, I believe, episode 13 or 14. And we will see you next week. Thank you for joining us.
Bye, everyone.